We're here to discuss the humanitarian crisis that's dominated the news agenda for the last few months. We have all, I'm sure, been moved by the extraordinary suffering we've seen on Europe's borders, but being upset about something is only half the story. You have to also believe that it's possible to resolve that if you're going to be able to turn that emotion into genuine change and an opportunity to respond to that crisis. So we have got a great panel. So we're going to start with Maurice Wren, who's the Chief Executive of the Refugee Council. He's a past Director of Asylum Aid and co-founder of the Independent Asylum Commission. Please welcome Maurice Wren.
Whatever we may say about Britain's proud history, action has only, in this campaign, been driven by tragedies in the Mediterranean and on the Eastern European migration routes, and the consequent politicking in the UK, chiefly between Number 10 and the Home Office, not by humanitarianism. I'd just point to the example of Germany over the last few months, where they blended humanitarianism with some hard-nosed thinking about what's best for Germany. Our government has always done the least it believed it could get away with, hence the original miserly commitment to take 500 Syrian refugees under the Vulnerable Persons Resettlement Scheme, and Cameron's subsequent, in his own words, extremely modest expansion of that scheme by around about 200 places. That reluctance to really commit to the UK has been compounded by the slow and under-resourced pace of implementation of even that modest programme. It's all changed in the last week. Now we have a Gold Command in the Home Office drawing in resources from other areas of the Home Office, but worryingly from other areas of the asylum system, at a time when asylum numbers are rising from spontaneous arrivals in the UK, and the Home Office is warning us all that major cuts are heading our way for the asylum system. We've seen, throughout the time we've been working in Parliament, genuine cross-party support. Yvette Cooper coming out in December 2013 for the Labour Party declaring that the UK should establish a resettlement programme, and a lot of media, supportive media interest. The reasons why we put resettlement at the centre of our campaign was that we knew that it would enable us to work closely and share intelligence with the United Nations High Commission for Refugees, as resettlement is one of the UNHCR's 3 durable solutions in refugee situations, the first 2 being return to country of origin or integration in the countries, the first receiver countries. And you look at the conditions in Turkey, Lebanon and Jordan, clearly integration isn't a possibility practically or politically in those countries. We promote resettlement because we know it works. The planning, the preparation and the relatively high level of resourcing that goes into it ensures that people are well integrated. Although we do it well, we do it at a very modest level in the UK, just less than 1,000 people a year currently. We know it's part funded by Europe, so the demand on the public purse in the UK is relatively limited. And we saw resettlement as an opportunity, and we see it as an opportunity with the 20,000 programme to galvanise local communities that have spoken so spontaneously and people around the country, and we will be working with City of Sanctuary Movement, with Amnesty and with Citizens UK to try and coordinate those actions at a local level and to make sure that when the UK says its refugees are welcome here, that we give practical expression to that in every town and city across the country. A quick look at what's actually happened in the last week since the Prime Minister made his announcement. Well, there has been speedy mobilisation by the Home Office. The government was criticised rightly in 2014 for the length of time it took to get anything off the ground, and we welcome the fact that it's being taken very seriously at a very high level. The initial focus will be on what the Home Office calls the traditional gateway model, where local authorities are contracted to provide housing and NGOs, voluntary sector, provide integration support for those brought in for a 1-year period. There is consideration being given in the Home Office to the idea of reception centres in case the flow of arrivals gets ahead of capacity to actually provide resettlement places. We recognise that might be an inevitability, and we're talking to them about the kind of wraparound provision you'd need to make reception centres viable. There is also consideration being given, and it starts tomorrow at a meeting in the Home Office, to the inclusion of separated children, currently running at over 3,000. Separated children that have been coming into the UK. That number will increase. People coming over in this programme will be given humanitarian protection for 5 years. That entitles them to the full suite of rights in the UK. And I think this is very critical, there will be a presumption at the end of the 5 years that if the people want to stay on, they will be allowed to. If the Home Office were to implement the programme, as the Prime Minister suggested, over the course of the Parliament, we could be talking at de minimis of 330-odd people arriving in the year. What we also sought to clarify with the Home Office is if there was sufficient capacity in the system early on in the Parliament, would that number rise? And the view was yes, there is no upper limit on how many we can take within that 20,000 envelope. There is a high level of engagement with the Local Government Association and government, and I'm delighted to say, as a Londoner, that London councils want to be part of this programme. Hitherto, they've not taken a role in it. And we will be working with fellow NGOs to establish what is being called the National Welcoming Board, so that we can work with other organisations to galvanise activity at a local level. 20,000 people. It's an important, it's a serious, and it's a substantial commitment, but it must only be a first step. We need more resettlement. The UNHCR estimate, latest estimate, is that they have identified 960,000 people worldwide in need of resettlement. We also need other safe and legal routes for people to secure protection, because we believe that's the only realistic way of undermining the smuggling market that is proliferating at the moment. Those other safe and legal routes include, but not exclusively, a relaxation of family reunification criteria. It's a shaming scandal that if a family made it over here, in that family group was a 19-year-old, they wouldn't be allowed to join their family group in the UK if they'd been left behind. We think the humanitarian visa system needs investigating. France are operating it, Brazil is operating it, where you can approach a consulate in a safe third country, and if on a prima facie assessment you're likely to qualify for refugee protection, you'll be given a visa to travel to that country. And we would like to see some investigation of the humanitarian or medical evacuations. We also want to see the UK playing its full part as a member of the European Union, working to share responsibility for those that have either made it to Europe already or are on their way or likely to be so. And we urge the UK government to change its position on contributing to the relocation of people who are already in the UK. We want to see flexibility over the operation of the Dublin system. That flexibility exists within the terms of Dublin, particularly around family reunification, and we urgently want a confirmation that there will be no returns under Dublin to countries that patently, even within Europe, are incapable of dealing with much more. So we think, looking forward, that there is a big role for local authorities as keepers of UK's humanitarian conscience. We recognise that this government in particular faces considerable political difficulties in moving further than they have gone before. So I think civil society needs to work hard to create some safe political space for the government to feel confident and comfortable about doing more than they pledged at the moment. UNHCR is suggesting 800,000 people will enter Europe by various routes this year, and they're projecting similar numbers for next year. What we are seeing is deteriorating conditions and a lack of hope in the refugee camps in the region, in the countries adjacent to Syria, and the consequent drift to cities and then the move to Europe as a result. We need to resist the notion that by investing in refugee resettlement, it absolves us of any responsibility for dealing with spontaneous arrivals. So a lot going on, and we need to welcome the government's announcement, but at the same time be vigilant about recognising it's not enough and more needs to be done. It cannot happen at the expense of the asylum system in the UK as a whole.
One of the missing elements coming out of the British response to what have primarily been Syrian refugees is any indication in the statements last week, except for the hint that there will be a discussion on renewed drone strikes or bombing in Syria itself to extend the existing campaign, which is conducted, at least formally, only in Iraq, alongside the US and other international partners. And its refugee response has been very bilateral. It has not taken place in conjunction with or indeed reference to European partners on the implicit assumption, and it's been spelled out again in the coverage, that the UK is not a member of the Schengen area. The main part of the crisis, if you like, the entry points of refugees are in Schengen states. And so this is an issue that implicitly in the UK debate is seen as one for Schengen. So therefore, the President of the Commission, Juncker's speech last week, we now need to move on, he was saying, to actually looking at a quota system to allocate a further 140,000 refugees. The debate has moved on very fast. There was a council meeting of interior ministers in Brussels, but it was preceded by the Germans suddenly closing the border and there being this domino effect, the barriers being put up on the Hungarian-Serbian border, the ricochet across the rest of Europe. These are emergency measures, we are told, but there really is a need for a long-term solution. The UK, though, is outside this, and hence the debate has shifted, quite rightly, but I do think it doesn't absolve the UK from some policy and some understanding that it can't completely escape the immediate refugee crisis situation, but everybody else who's on continental Europe is having to deal with the immediate crisis and problem. The underlying premise is that in practice only 3% of Syrian total refugees within the region, namely the 8 million who are displaced within Syria itself and the 4 million now in camps or elsewhere. Many of them are not actually in refugee camps. But 97% of these refugees within the region, it's half the population essentially of Syria at the time that war broke out or the violence broke out in 2011, also need our attention. And of course, the benefits of dealing with people in the region is that you can actually focus on rehousing them closer to their places of origin. It will also undercut the people traffickers at source. And the British government pride themselves on being the second highest after the US net donor to UN appeals, humanitarian appeals for these refugees. The problem with this is that the Europeans, although individually as states they're not giving as much, there's a regular shortfall, which has meant over the last certainly 3-4 years, a shortfall in the amount of money available for food, medicine, but critically the drive and the dynamic which this has created within the refugee camps, but also amongst those other refugee populations, is that without access to jobs, without access to education, they see no future. They are getting desperate. They can only see the only way out is to use what resources they can gain access to or the few savings they have left to pay the traffickers what the traffickers demand. So arguments about stemming the traffickers at source will only stack up if there is such an influx of money that jobs and education within refugee camps is actually targeted as a main objective, and that's not going to happen over the short term, even if it becomes an objective in an overall policy response to Syria. And in fact, nobody has a clear policy towards Syria as a whole. You need to stem the cause for so many people leaving the region. But on the trafficking side, the UK has certainly been leading efforts at the UN to gain a UN Security Council resolution to bolster, if you like, the role of the EU Naval Force Med, which was started earlier in the year when the main trafficking network, if you like, was from Libya into Italy. Now, I haven't seen any evidence, and I might be behind the loop on this, that this has now been extended to the more serious routes through the Balkans. This influx we've seen recently is not going to end here because the drivers, the pull factors into Europe, which have been so cited in British official policy, are already in place. There are no jobs, there's no education. The vulnerability of those children, which rightly the government is seeking to help within the camps, has not been fully addressed. It does actually mean having a much deeper and wider discussion about the Dublin regulation, for example. The state that a refugee first arrives in is the state in which he or she has to apply for asylum. Is evidently not being the case for the majority of people arriving in Greece and Italy. And they are assisted in some cases to move on to other European states. This has to be a European-wide agreement. What is concerning, though, is the lack of an overall strategy to dealing with the sources of this, because we also in the background have a 60-year plus problem with Palestinian refugees who, if we continue to say the best way to deal with people is just to house them, you deprive people of agency in their own futures. We talk about refugees as victims and not people who can actually devise solutions of their own. And I think this demand for jobs and education actually filters into debates about how we deal with refugees here. They should have the right to work. And the UK will have problems in trying to renegotiate its terms of membership, or something which will extend the reform programmes in which the UK plays an active part in Europe, unless it plays a role in the immediate refugee crisis. And that means addressing those refugees who are already on European soil, a number of whom wish to reach Britain. As we know, we have heard very little about provisions for those in Calais. We do need to settle this in the broader context of what kind of societies we want to be and what kind of needs we have economically. The City of London wishes to open the doors immediately to be able to pick and choose the economic migrants that they wish to see in the City of London. We have other employers saying we have skill shortages. We even hear heads of NHS trusts saying we'll have a dire shortage of nurses if we keep restricting access. This is a debate that needs to be taking place in the context of those who are rightly saying we are already a densely populated island, we have no more space. We have no more space because we have no facilities and housing for people in this country. We have to address those concerns as legitimate, but I think blocking that debate off by saying we in the UK are not part of the crisis which is immediately going on in Europe is to fail to recognise that crisis is still going to be there in coming months. It was probably going to get worse, and it's coming our way too.
I spent some time in Sicily and then Rome and then Milan. I met so many young people who were all under the age of 18 from all parts of sub-Saharan Africa, all having gone through Libya at some stage, all having been through the sort of horrible stories of being sold to people, but not all of them were refugees and not all of them were migrants. It was a real profound experience for me, given that I came here as a 9-year-old unaccompanied some 22 years ago, except I was on a nice plane and had landed in June and I was in primary school by September. Things have changed massively since then. And so what I heard was sort of these proud young people who had such high expectations on their tiny shoulders. And a lot of them really did look and sound like children, but they'd never known any childhood. And their appetite to try and find a better world was insatiable. What was particularly interesting for me as well is they saw Europe as a place where they could realize their potential, a place where they could genuinely change the course of their own personal destinies, but also the destinies of those that they had left behind. As I spoke to them, it also became clear that the more flow of social media, information, smartphones that they were using as these young people, and the more easier it was becoming to actually make these treks, because intelligence was being shared, information was being shared, and they were constantly thinking about better, hopefully slightly less difficult journeys. Also, a lot of them had a great deal of, relatives in Europe and America. Now, why do I say all of this in terms of a preface to the policy discussions that we're having? Well, this problem, however you want to determine it, is only just beginning. And we haven't seen anything yet. And I'm not just talking about poverty, because some people's positions in life have become so insecure, and for many it's been compounded by war and further insecurity. The more people are going to want to move quicker, and they're going to move in ways that they may not necessarily have had the means to do so before. What we are also seeing is the clear developed world, for the first time, seeing in a very, very physical way the consequences of their own success and their own progress, and the lack of success and the lack of progress for the rest of the world. As the gulf between those who have and those who don't have continues to get wider, so will this dream and this ambition to want to do better continue. And I heard so many stories. I want to be a scientist, or I want to be a doctor because I know that every pound that I earn there is worth 10 times here. What we are seeing before us is the consequences of the kind of things that the Western countries have been up to coming to their doorstep, whether that be the consequences of ill-thought-through and botched interventions, whether that be the trade laws that are completely skewed against the developing countries, and whether that be the colonial legacy that continues. Now, that is not to suggest that we let off the hook the corrupt, disgusting leaders who have completely stolen the futures of sub-Saharan Africa in this particular story. It's all well and good to say that we need to have a much better conversation about how we deal with this. But I believe that so long as we continue to have a world where so much is in the hands of so few and so many just continue to go by in a horrible situation, what we are seeing will continue to go on. And I don't have the answer to this, but I genuinely do believe that this is a moment for us to really recalibrate how we see ourselves, how we see our neighbors everywhere around the world. It's a moment for us to have a proper conversation about bold ideas in relation to development, and not just resettlement, not just about, oh, we'll take 20,000 in a parliament and then Germany's having to deal with the numbers that we have seen, but actually a wider conversation around the world that actually says, why is this happening now? And why is it happening in the numbers that it's happening? And that cannot be addressed, in my judgment, if we ignore the wider structural issues which are pervasive across everything, whether it's colonial history, whether it's interventions, whether it's about money and resources. I'm only really interested in very serious conversations and serious reactions that aren't based on what politicians think where the public is. When the chips are down, the fences go up. And that is everybody looking after their own selfish interest. And that's simply not going to work.